Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, this is probably not going to make most people who are concerned about contracting measles very happy to see an article like this because measles is not just something to ignore. Because what I've noticed recently, and this is just in my local area in Los Angeles and California, is that when you go into stores like CVS, Rite Aid, there are pharmacy stores, they're offering for people the measles shots. That's how you know how serious it is. And recently, going into the physician's office, they are also offering the measles shot, and they're putting a lot of emphasis on it. And so that's how you know that the outbreak is pretty serious, because usually when something's not as serious, when it's a medical issue, you don't really see it as being a big issue until it comes to your city, your state, or your town, and you have physicians that are stressing and they're offering that you check your vaccination record to see if you have up to date shots. And they're going through explanations, and they're also ordering shots for people who, if you had shots years ago and you want to make sure that you're, you know, I guess, triply vaccinated so that you can maintain your health under this threat of measles. So this article I saw, I found it rather interesting. It says, despite measles warning, the warnings are out there. And it says anti-vaccine rally draws hundreds, not just a few, but hundreds of ultra-Orthodox Jews. Now, the problem with this is, I know there's different religious groups, but just looking at this, is another vehicle, or let's say more ammunition, for those who have issues with people who are from this population. Um, and you've already heard where some people pretty much will say a lot of things where they're against Jew population. And so by seeing articles like this, it just adds fuel to the fire for those who would otherwise not be too pleased about finding out that there's a specific religious group that supports not being vaccinated. Okay. And so I'm going to read into this article, but what makes it so disturbing is that babies could die, people could die, innocent people could die, or could get extremely ill. If you don't die, you can get extremely ill, is what I've heard. And so it's that serious. So it says a vaccine symposium, this was in Rockland County, was denounced by the health authorities. This is how bad it is, y'all, with these people, where even the health authorities denounced this rally. And some ultra-Orthodox rabbis who said that the speakers were spreading dangerous propaganda. Okay, so here's the rally here, and hundreds were in attendance at an anti-vaccine rally in Montsey, New York, in Rockland County. Okay, so this is not a good look, but look at the crowd of people. So, this movement has a lot of momentum, where people actually believe that getting vaccinated is against their religion. And I guess maybe the article might expound on this, but this is by a Kimco de Frestas Tamur. Okay, so this was May 14, 2019. In Monse, New York, the ultra-Orthodox rabbi falsely describes the measles outbreak among Jews as part of an elaborate plan concocted by Mayor Bill de Blasio, okay, of New York to deflect attention from more serious diseases brought by Central American migrants. Wow. Let me read that again. That's how serious and how crazy this is. So it says ultra Orthodox rabbi falsely described the measles outbreak among Jews as part of an elaborate plan concocted by Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York to deflect attention from more serious diseases brought by Central American migrants. So a pediatrician questioned whether the Jews were being intentionally given bad lots of vaccine that ended up giving children a new strain of viruses. And Andrew Wakefield, the British doctor who studied linking measles vaccines with autism, was widely discredited and condemned, appeared via Skype to offer an almost apocalyptic vision, okay, of a world in which vaccines were giving rise to the deadlier immunization resistance disease. So there is your explanation as to why there's so many people that are for not getting vaccinated or not taking the measles shot. And so, for those of you, if you want to look at this is out of the New York Times. So, this is pretty serious. So, there's a lot of propaganda involved in this, political media attention that is being given to this. And it's involving religion and involving also fear that is causing people to not be vaccinated because they feel there's a plot. It says a pediatrician questioned whether Jews were being intentionally given bad lots of vaccine that ended up giving their children a new strain of these viruses. And so this British doctor, Andrew Wakefield, he's linking measles vaccine with autism. And I've heard that one before too. I've heard some people talking and they were talking about how sometimes some of the vaccines have caused their kids not to walk or has pretty much exacerbated other problems with their children's health or has also caused they fear that it has caused autism, a rise in autism. So we Hasidim have been chosen as the target, said the rabbi Hillel Hadler. The campaign against us has been successful. So, since the measles outbreak began last fall, the health authorities have embarked on a sweeping and exhaustive campaign, repeatedly urging people to get vaccinated and fighting the spread of misinformation. So, they have made special efforts in the ultra Orthodox communities of Brooklyn and Rockland County, New York, where the disease has been spreading very quickly. But the rally on Monday in Monse, a Rockland County hamlet about 30 miles northwest of New York City, vividly illustrates how the anti vaccine fever is not only enduring, but may be growing. Okay, so this is going to be an ongoing problem, it looks to be. It's bigger than what people have thought. So hundreds of ultra-Orthodox Jews packed a ballroom for a vaccine symposium with leaders of the anti-vaccine movement. So there's a huge movement going on behind people not getting vaccinated for measles shots. So, organized by a Marseille-based Jewish group, the event also showed how the movement was gaining ground. Greg Mitchell, a Washington-based lobbyist who represents the Church of Scientology, attended the meeting and addressed the crowd, offering to be their voice in the public policy game. So the gathering was denounced by local elected officials and health authority as well, and some ultra-Orthodox rabbis who said that the speakers were spreading propaganda that could cause the outbreak to deepen, risking the health of countless people. Exactly what I'm thinking. It's going to be a really huge issue very soon. It's actually happening now. And so a related article says that an outbreak spreads fear. So the measles, the ultra-Orthodox Jews of anti-Semitism. Okay, so the event was held in a large ballroom, as is customary at ultra-Orthodox gatherings. The men were separated by the improvised wall from the women, and speakers were introduced and applauded as they were uh, celebrities. So the remarks and the rapt audience illustrated how the anti-vaccination movement can exploit fear and anxiety within relatively insular communities. All right, so especially religious ones, to undercut scientifically sound warnings from health experts. So they were doubling down and increasing their messaging, capitalizing on fear. So Dr. Jane Zucker, the Assistant Commissioner of Immunization for New York City Health Department, said in an interview, parents are afraid of who and what to believe because of their children. And I've heard parents talking that, oh, I got my kid a vaccination shot, and then they couldn't walk, and then there's a lot of stuff going on. Or as soon as I didn't get the shot, my kid was fine, so all of this is floating around. And so that perpetuates more fear. So, Rabbi, that's additional I'm putting in. I've heard these talks by some parents at schools who have, there's back and forth. There's some who are for getting all of the shots and having their kid vaccinated, and then there's other parents who think the shots have caused their kids to have health issues that are long term, such as autism or not being able to walk. I've heard those stories, and so, which I thought were rather interesting, but I don't know if they have any proof to back it up because they didn't produce any. It was just talk, but when you hear parents talk like that amongst other parents, fears begin to grow. And so that's why I'm relating it to this article, because I can understand how that could be something that's real prevalent in this time with the measles outbreak. So Rabbi Handler, a 77-year-old from Brooklyn, who said that he was a Holocaust survivor himself, set the tone for the night, claiming that Jews were being persecuted as disease carriers and were being attacked on the street of New York City for sneezing. So the Anti-Defamation League has strongly objected to the appropriation of Holocaust symbols by vaccine critics. Okay, so this is getting pretty sticky here. So Mr. de Blasio has issued a public health emergency for the zip codes in Brooklyn where ultra-Orthodox Jews live. And so you see how this could turn into something also about race and who people are affiliated with in terms of culture, and that this could get really messy. So that decision appeared to have earned him the Irie of Rabbi Handler, who described Mr. de Blasio as a sneaky fellow. and a closet German. So Wilhelm, his real name was named after Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. So in fact, none of this is really true. It says here that Mr. de Blasio was born Warren Wilhelm Jr. and later decided to take his mother's last name and his own after being alienated from his father. And so, in a telephone interview on Tuesday, Rabbi Handler sought to soften his anti-vaccine remarks. I don't mind if someone takes a vaccine, but it's not my business, he said. What I am a what am I a fascist? What am I a fascist? That's the question he's posing. So am I going to bring down the law? So pretty much I think this was the duration of this article, but um no, there's more to the article. So it fools me because of the they have ads. So I think mainly, no, it goes a little bit longer in depth. So let me see. Where were we? The pediatrician who spoke on Monday night, Dr. Lawrence Pales, Pel, Pelvesky, Pelvisky, is regularly cited in pamphlets circulated in New York City that urge women not to get their children vaccinated. That's pretty serious there. So his views have no basis in science, experts said. So at the rally, he talked at length about mutating viruses and falsely claimed that, wow, this is really scary. Just reading this, looking at this, so it says that his views have no basis in science, experts said. So at the rally, he talked at length about mutating viruses and falsely claimed that failed vaccines were producing a new strain of measles. So women scribbled into notepads as he spoke. So others filmed his comments, sending them to their contacts on WhatsApp. Essentially, he said that there were no studies available to show the vaccine effects on human bodies. So it is possible the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine that is somehow being given in the lot or this lot to the communities in Williamsburg and Lakewood and Monse, maybe in Borough Park. Is it possible that these lots are bad? So that's the question that's being raised. Are the measles that the vaccine, measles vaccine that this particular group is getting, it feels as though they feel the fear is growing that they feel that they're being attacked. And so he asked, referring to areas in New York and New York, Jersey, with large ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. So it's fascinating because we're told how contagious this disease is, but somehow it's centered in the Jewish community. See, do you see what I'm saying? This is pretty scary. So Dr. Pelvisky could not be reached for comment on Tuesday. So Mr. Wakefield, who was stripped of his medical license in his native Britain some 2 decades ago for fraudulent claims linking vaccines to autism, accused the health authorities and Center of Disease Control and Prevention of misleading the public. So there's a fight, a battle between these individuals and these entities, and so that's what makes this pretty prevalent. So it goes on to say, but before doing that, he insisted on his own innocence. So I wanted to reassure you that I have never been involved in specific fraud, he said via Skype from the darkened room, his face appearing eerily white as it was projected onto two large overhead screens. So what happened to me is what happens to doctors who threaten the bottom line of the pharmaceutical company. So here we go into that because there has been a lot of fears with pharmaceutical companies that, for one, that they're profiting off of people being sick and charging ridiculous amounts of money for these medicines, and they want to keep you getting medicines and staying sick, which we know that a lot of that is happening. So we can vouch that a lot of that is true. That when you take medicines, they have other ingredients in it. And so what you're taking the medicine for to cure one illness, there may be two other hidden problems that you'll end up having because of side effects of taking the medication. And so, therefore, you'll end up having to take more medicine, which means that's more money for pharmaceutical companies. And so, there's been a lot of talk about that. And so, with that kind of being in the midst of all this, it makes it kind of really muddied. So, Rockland County has the highest number of record cases after New York City. Okay. But there are other pockets of large outbreaks as well. And so it continues after the article. The CDC said on Monday that the number of measles reported across the country rose to 75 last week, bringing the total to 839 in 23 states. So the highest number of cases in the U.S. has since seen this measles outbreak was declared eliminated in the early 2000. So New York City alone has had seen 498 confirmed cases of the disease since September. So in the rest of New York State, there have been 274 confirmed cases according to official figures, but about 80% of those cases were located in Rockland County, just the county that holds rallies. So New York authorities have used a number of tactics to force people to get immunized, including excluding the unvaccinated children from going to schools with low vaccination rates, or threatening thousands of dollar fines on parents for failing to vaccinate their children. The strategies have been largely successful, health officials have insisted, even though there have been setbacks. So in Rockland County, for example, the state of emergency declaration in March that banned unvaccinated children from public spaces was challenged by parents and halted by a judge, ruled that the outbreak did not legally merit an emergency declaration. So the county executive, Ed Day, issued a new declaration last month that sought to prevent people who were exposed to measles from being in public places. So it continues. Local officials, including Mr. Day and Rabbi Chaim Shabies, express outrage in the joint statement at the outsiders who organized Monday's rally and are targeting our community, as he says. Tonight's event and the misinformation being shared at it runs counter to every statement from the medical experts and elected officials of our county. The statement reads, so this type of propaganda endangers the health and safety of children within our community and around the world and must be denounced in the strongest language possible. And so that is pretty much the article. And so that's how serious this measles thing with the anti-vaccine movement has been getting. It is gaining momentum. And I want to bring back that screen of the hundreds of people who believe that you should not vaccinate your children, that you as adults should not vaccinate. And this is gaining momentum. And this is who is pretty much at the forefront of this. And so this is pretty scary. So I never thought we would be coming in a time where people feel the need to create a movement based on vaccines. So this is changing the way the world is, what we used to have, where they finally got a hold of the measles and pretty much were able to control it. Now it is becoming an issue where it is out of control. And so there's a lot of growing fears. So what are your thoughts and feedback on this? Because this doesn't look like it's going to get any better. And so among other things. And so I'm going to switch gears And I'm going to go to another topic, which this topic is not listed, but you see this pictured here, and this is out of CNN. This is an additional article. Tackling white supremacy as terrorism, experts say. So I found this article as well. This is by Mallory, Simon, and a Sara Sidner out of CNN. So this is also New York. Okay. So Americans are being killed, murdered. Okay, so let me stop before I go into this. So I saw this and I thought this was also something that it isn't about the measles, but it's about terrorism. And so looking at that article with the measles and then looking at the group that is promoting not getting vaccinated, let's take a look at this issue here. So, tackling white supremacy as terrorism, experts say. So, this is out of New York, CNN. Americans are being killed, murdered not for what they have or done or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, they're being killed, slaughtered again and again because whether they're Jewish, black, or simply not pure whites, they are seen as pestilence to be purged. Now, I recently viewed a documentary and it was about the alt-right and it was about also counter groups called Antifa, which is anti-fascist groups. And they fight against these alt-right groups. And it was pretty interesting, but it also made light of what happened in Charlotte, where some people were injured at a rally and one woman was murdered by a car being hurled into or barreled into a group of people that were protesters. And so this is really not getting any better. And we just heard that, already we have people who are what you call homegrown terrorism. And you sometimes have lone wolf terrorists. Well, you know, that just puts fuel to the fire that they're going to lump every Jewish person to anti-vaxxer movement. I feel that just adds fuel to the fire. If I believe ultra-Orthodox, that's a certain group of people that are in a particular religion, and so they'll be attacked for that, I'm sure. Um, And so that kind of adds to it. And then you have just people that are from different backgrounds that are looked or viewed as minority groups. And it says here Jewish, black, or you're simply not pure white, that you're having to deal with hate crime and murder. So their murders are followers of a vile and hateful ideology that meets the FBI definition. Finally, they're labeling this as not just hate groups, but it's labeled as a definition of terrorism. But some top, current, and former law enforcement officials say that they are not treated as terrorists because they are American and that they are white, which is true. And they don't usually look or view them as terrorists. They just look at it as an isolated incident, but it's becoming so prevalent now. And so now this article is really scary because it goes into more detail about how they view this. But it says, but amid the rising number of deadly white supremacist attacks, the officials say that must change. So white supremacy must be called terrorism and be tackled with the same vigor as ISIS and Al Qaeda. So Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance came to that realization while investigating the homicides of a black man in the center of New York City. A 66-year-old Timothy Coleman was walking alone in Midtown Manhattan collecting cans to recycle when a man approached him from behind, and that man plunged a sword through his chest, through Common's chest. So Common uttered his last words as to turn toward the killer. Why are you doing this? The man continued to stab him. Common bled to death, and the answer to Common's question would soon become clearer. His killer, James Jackson, had come to New York from Maryland with a plan to start a race war. So this was more than a murder, Vance decided. So it was more than a hate crime. It was a targeted killing of a black man with an aspiration of dividing the races to keep killing each other and ending in death of every black person in the U.S. and around the world, according to Jackson's manifesto, Vance said. So the case was a seminal one for the district attorney's office and for the New York state, where it was first domestic terrorism conviction. It was a domestic terrorism conviction of its kind, the first that they've seen. So Vance hopes it sends this message. So I think we need to call it what it really is, he said on CNN. He told CNN. So here he is pictured here. This is an act of terrorism, Vance explained. So he's saying these are terrorism acts. This exists in our country and it happened here. And so he is declaring this is a Manhattan District Attorney, Cy Vance, who charged a white supremacist with a domestic terrorism charge. So this man here, he says that they should call these white supremacy groups who are going out and pretty much perpetuating this homegrown terrorism as terrorists. So it's just that Americans have are having a hard time admitting it. He said, it is much easier, Vance continued, for people to call someone a terrorist when they have a different skin color or don't speak English. But if you're trying to spread fear and wipe out a specific group of people like Jackson was, then you must call them terrorists, he said also. So just because they're white, they weren't calling them terrorists. But if you weren't white and you did a crime similar or something that was a criminal act, you were labeled a terrorist. But if you're white, you weren't labeled a terrorist. Well, Vance, District Attorney Cy Vance says it's the same thing. They should be labeled as terrorists. And so, but if you're trying to spread fear and wipe out a specific group of people like Jackson was, then you must call them terrorists. He said calling someone a terrorist not only raises the profile of the case, but it can yield additional charges and higher sentences. And so that's probably the reason why a lot of these white supremacist groups were not getting higher sentences because they were just viewed as doing a criminal act, but not viewed as terrorist acts. And so, if they had been viewed as what it really was, a terrorist act, a homegrown terrorist act, then maybe the sentencing would have been more harder. So, on the face of it, the killing of Common fits into the FBI category of domestic terrorism. So, perpetuated by individuals and groups inspired and associated with primarily US based movements that espouse extremism, ideologies of a political, religious, social, racial, and environmental nature. So, Common's murder may not have been sparked a national outcry, but it is part of a very public, growing, deadly trend of domestic terror attacks committed largely by white men, from the Charleston Church massacre through the killing of a protester in Charlottesville and the shootings of the synagogues in Pittsburgh, Poway, and far-right extremists are responsible for or suspected of most of the ideological killings in America in the last 10 years, according to the data from the Anti-Defamation League, which is abbreviated ADL, which tracks extremist activity. And so this is a scene out of Charlottesville right here. And so this is how serious this gets here with these protests. And this is the exact scene I saw. It's on Netflix. If you stream any from any streaming station, you'll see there's documentaries that show a recount of these protests. And by the way, this group, this alt-right group, actually, after they committed this act, they went back to the area that they committed the act and did another rally on top of that. And so James Fields plowed into protesters in Charlottesville rally. So white supremacist murders in the US more than doubled in 2017. So with a far-right extremist group with white supremacists responsible for 59% of all extremist-related fatalities in the US in 2017, ADL's audit shows this. So they were responsible for 20% of the fatalities the year before. And so, depending on who you ask, white supremacist terrorism is either not a problem or the biggest threat to American democracy in years, but one that's often ignored. So, President Donald Trump has said he does not regard white nationalism as a rising global threat. So, when asked in the aftermath of the New Zealand mosque massacre if he saw a worrying rise of white supremacy movements around the world, he replied, I don't really. I think it's a small group of people that have very, very serious problems, I guess. And that was his response. So intelligence and law enforcement officials under Trump maintain that they work to keep up with all threats, though they often don't single out white supremacist groups or supremacism publicly, instead referring to domestic terror as a whole. So a Department of Homeland Security official said the department has a center for faith and opportunity that works with houses of worship to prepare for acts of terrorism, and there are other programs that are religious and other communities that can use to help protect against hate crimes. But it's still a mistake not to call out white supremacy, according to the former head of the Countering Violent Extremism Task Force at Department of Homeland Security, George Selim. If the same number of Americans had been killed at the hands of an individual that was inspired or directed by a foreign terrorist organization, you can bet that this Congress and any administration, irrespective of political party, would be reacting much differently, he said. So, Department of Homeland Security declined to answer specific questions on this story. So, Selim will take his arguments to Congress on Wednesday, and when he testifies in front of the House Oversight Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. So, the hearing is titled Confronting White Supremacy: The Consequences of Inaction. And so here it is right here, a picture of the President Obama is briefed by George Selim, second from left, ahead of the White House summit on countering violent extremism. And so that is a talk. So it's a subject Selim feels he knows too well. But during the Bush and Obama administrations, he was often in the room, whether the Situation Room or the Oval Office, when key decisions were made about tackling extremism at home, which is homegrown terrorism. And so, and as they saw the threat of white supremacists grow, Selim said that he worked with colleagues on federal programs, specifically at Department of Homeland Security, and aimed to address and intervene during the radicalization process. Okay, so they were on the cusp of creating a system to do just that, he said. With bipartisan support, key puzzle pieces were being put in place in the final months of the Obama administration, he said. So, and then Trump took office. Selim said during the first 7 months of the administration, there was a decimation of the people, resources, and prioritization of the key programs and infrastructure that was aimed at working with law enforcement counter messaging, community resilience, and engagement and outreach. So he became so frustrated he quit. So he saw that the domestic terroristic acts killing Americans were predominantly perpetuated by those with views titled to white nationalism or supremacy, but the new administration had different priorities. So it's a significant enough threat that the federal government needs to devote significantly more people, money, time to both assess the ultimately and mitigate, argued Selim, who now leads the education, law enforcement, and community security programs with ADL and oversees the work of the Group Center on Extremism. So the new moral, or the new normal, radicalized white men, it's the new normal. Okay, so in some ways, the precursors of the racist murderers mirror those before foreign terrorist attacks. So the radicalization, specifically online, is similar to those who pledge allegiance to ISIS or Al Qaeda, experts say. So one of the noticeable difference is that these extremists are white. So Timothy Coleman's murder focused on his hatred of African American men before traveling to New York City and killing him. So this is the guy here who killed the black man that was picking up cans. He plunged a sword through his chest. So white supremacist James Jackson was sentenced to life in prison for terror attack of a black man. So this is him. His name is James Jackson. So he was sentenced to prison, life in prison. And so, in the 3 weeks before Jackson's attack, he spent huge amounts of his days and nights online studying Nazism and extremism until he was apparently pushed on the edge. Vance said interracial dating was an insurmountable problem in his mind. And so he read obsessively about Dylan Roof, who killed 9 black worshippers in the Charleston massacre in 2015, Vance said. The racial war starts today, Jackson wrote in a manifesto. According to Vance, Negroes are obviously first on the list for extermination. So the gunmen in Charleston and in Pittsburgh and Poway suspect all engage in hateful speech online before taking their rage and turning it into a deadly action. And so here is a woman that mourns the memorial outside the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which people were murdered. Officials acknowledge this pattern as it's one reason that Selim believes something can be done to stop these people who are sometimes categorized as untraceable, and what I said, lone wolves. So Selim said that too often there seems to be a reluctance to name white men as possibly dangerous. And so this girl that's pictured here, she's the girl that was shot. Girl shot in synagogue attack. He was aiming at the kids. Okay, so there's been multiple attacks in synagogues and in places where it has to do with hate crime, extremism, and terrorism, all wrapped up in a ball. So, and that in itself is dangerous because white supremacists and nationalists are a real and persistent threat, he says. And so, as I look forward to the next 5 to 10 or more years, we need to acclimate ourselves to the new normal. So, this is sort of the thing that's going to happen that will, among others, worries and fears about measles and religious groups that support not getting vaccinated. We have these homegrown terrorists, and they start online radicalizing people, and the movements are getting bigger, which is very scary. So you could be minding your own business, you could be mowing your lawn, you could be picking up cans, you could be somebody walking to school or going to your job, and you could run into one of these people and be killed. Not because you did anything, not because you were at the wrong place at the wrong time, which you probably were, but it's not your fault. It's because these people radicalized and they're on a hate campaign, but it's worse than that. They believe that they should exterminate all people who are not pure white or not white at all, or at least not pure white in minority groups, um, as they look to see it. And so as I look forward, it goes on, it says the next 10 or more years, we need to acclimate ourselves to the new normal, which is increased incidences of domestic extremism, domestic terrorism, anti Semitism. And what I was saying with that, which is a sticky gray area, is that anti vaxxer movement. The group that's spearheading it is an ultra-Orthodox Jewish group, which that doesn't do it any good service when you see what's going on here. And so then they have acts of bigotry and Islamophobia and exophobia that target ethnic and religious minority groups. And so this is really crazy. So you see how this kind of, it backfires on one another. You're trying to help a lot of people not get killed for who they are and what they support in their religious backgrounds. Yet you have these groups who are pushing this anti-vaccine movement, and that doesn't make it any easier. So, in terms of that particular group. So once we understand that is very likely the new normal, then that we can put a place in place of the strong infrastructure related to counterterrorism and community resilience that we've already built up and focused it on the new threats that we know we're going to be facing. These really don't look like new threats to me. They look like they were already there and they were brewing. And I feel this is, I'm going to add in my own thing here, that who we have and whom we have in office that represents the country of the U.S. kind of makes people feel emboldened and empowered to carry out these acts of violence. And the reason why the rise of the violence is going is because of who we have in office, because they feel like this president is their president. It's a reflection of white supremacy and nationalism, and that's who they wanted in office. And when he says things like Africa's an asshole or a shithole, or if he says things against people that are from other countries, that's what they want to hear. And so that gives rise to these groups, and it only adds fuel to the fire. And now we've got groups who are in religious groups that are in fear of getting vaccinated, and that doesn't sit well with the general population of people who are for vaccination. So it just really muddies the water more. So with the administration prioritizing other matters, Selim is hoping legislators will hold them accountable and encourage action beyond denunciation of extremism, um, atrocities. So he insists that some attacks that cost lives are preventable. Okay. So he advocates for cooperation between the law enforcement, social media companies, community leaders, and groups like ADL. And he believes that the initiative he led at the Department of Homeland Security, which is also still, it's DHS, would have borne fruit if funding had been continued. So the setback won't be able to be measured here and now. So someone said, I can't tell you that funding is these programs would have prevented Pittsburgh or Poway, but I can say in good conscience that we sure would have stood a better chance at preventing or intervening in incidences like this had funding for these programs continued. So sign a powerful message. Ms. Sellum is hoping Congress will take steps on the identification of dangerous white supremacists, which I doubt it. That's my interjection in there. So this is Manhattan DA Vance is hoping that the same people will take action on what can be done with suspects once identified. Many states do not have terrorism laws on the books or prosecute cases the way that he did with the murder of Common, who called himself a can and bottle recycler and autograph collector on his Twitter account. where he posted a photo of himself waiting to vote for the 2016 election. And so this was the guy here. I don't know if you guys remember that, but this man was killed simply because he was black. A sword was plunged into his chest by this James guy who earlier on I showed you a picture of him, and I will pan back up. He was sentenced to life in prison. This man right here, his name is Timothy Common, and he just was a can and bottle recycler in New York. And so he was killed simply for being black. So standing in line to vote, I love America. He wanted to vote in 2016. So what Vance stands by his decision, it really is no different from him to come and to seek out to kill black men and women than a radical Islamist to come to a place to seek out and kill men and women who weren't in the same faith as them. So Vance said it's the same thing. Basically, he's pretty much comparing the two. It's just that, they don't call the white men terrorists. So the ones that perpetuate the hate crimes and the killings and murders. So calling it terrorism and getting a life sentence can send a powerful message that white nationalism will not be normalized in New York, Vance said. So he wrote a letter of the House Appropriations Committee urging them to increase federal law enforcement funding on this issue. But we can no longer sleep on the danger posed by the country's increasing number of white nationalists. And so we cannot continue to treat this type of hate fueled violence as a lesser form of terrorism, lest we risk normalizing this repulsive behavior and missing opportunities to prevent future attacks. And so this is Mr. McGarity. So he's Assistant Director Counterterrorism. Michael McGarity testified in FBI 850 open domestic terrorism investigations, 40% of which of the cases of racially motivated violent extremism are prevalent. So FBI Assistant Director Michael McGarity testified to the House Committee on Homeland Security last week that the Bureau is doing its part to tackle the issue on the federal level. So he shared that the Trump administration has added domestic terrorism to its national security strategy, a first for the country. So we're highlighting that there is a domestic terrorism threat that is persistent. And so remember at first they made it look like the terrorism, the homegrown terrorism and the race war type stuff wasn't that big of an issue. Well, when you see lawmakers and it's on CNN and they're starting to talk about putting it to the forefront and Department of Homeland Security has their eye watch on it, they have percentages of people's deaths and murders. It's real. It's becoming a real big problem, and they even have documentaries now that are cropping up about all these white nationalist movements that are coming to the forefront. It's not as small as people thought it to be. And so we're highlighting that there is a domestic terrorism threat that is persistent, McGarity said, and we don't differentiate. Okay, so between domestic terrorism attack, we're trying to stop or international terrorism attack. So it's one and the same. Yeah, either it's international or it's domestic. They're all terrorist attacks. So it's a terrorism attack that we're looking to stop, he said. But to Selim, the lack of specificity was troubling. So he wanted to hear officials say white supremacists, white terror, white nationalist terrorism. And you can't get that. You don't get them to say those terms. And some of us are probably not too surprised with that. But to voice this is what is an unsettling truth. Today's terrorism in the US is most often perpetuated by Americans who look more like the founding fathers than foreign-born jihadists. So this continues on. And it goes on to show Jeff Sessions, who promised a tough response from the federal authorities after the Charlottesville attack. So the Attorney General Jeff Sessions initially told ABC's Good Morning America that killing of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville met the definition of domestic terrorism. But Heather Heyer, she's a white woman. She was protesting, she was counter protesting against white nationalism. But James Fells, who drove the car into the counter protesters, had at a high speed, wasn't charged with being a terrorist. There is no single crime of domestic terrorism. He wasn't charged with that. He was just charged with the murder. So for those of you who are looking at Dylan Roof, who is left, James Fells, center, were not charged with terrorism, and James Jackson, who is at right under the New York state law. None of these men, even though all of them showed that they were a part of different belief sets, white nationalism, or they supported some form of racial bigotry, were not charged with homegrown or terrorism, or being labeled as terrorists, homegrown terrorists. So another case is the Coast Guard lieutenant currently accused of plotting a domestic terror attack. Prosecutors say that he planned to conduct a mass killing of prominent Democratic politicians and the members of news media, including CNN people. But without a law saying domestic terrorism is a crime, he can only be charged with the lesser offenses. So to illustrate how ridiculous the current situation is, when I was in the FBI investigating people inspired by international terrorist groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, the mere association with those groups was enough to land someone behind bars, said Joseph Campbell, CNN law enforcement analyst, former FBI special agent. So not so with domestic terrorism. It's a different ball game because you're looking at white nationalists or people that are part of certain groups, are there separatists. So even if someone is politically motivated to cause violence due to their far right or left wing extremist views, that's enough to get them off the street. Opponents to such a law claim it might infringe on free speech. And so that word came up a lot, free speech, in the documentary, is that at what extent can free speech be free speech? And how does it play out, if it impedes on the lives of innocent people or if it threatens the lives of innocent people? So the issue appears to be a political third rail that few in Congress actually want to touch. So Campbell said the FBI Agents Association, a private organization that represents the Bureau of approximately 13,000 special agents, has been very vocal about the need for new legislation that would equip law enforcement with the tools needed to stop these threats. And so here, FBI Agents Association, you see it's issued the following statement. Today's events are a reminder of the national threat posed by domestic terrorism, the vital role that law enforcement plays in thwarting these threats. FBI Agent Association. So Congress and White House to ensure the federal law enforcement has the tools to track, investigate, punish domestic terrorists as well. So this means amending the U.S. Code to include a penalty for domestic terrorism, regardless of the target or weapon. So a scary silence. Last week's House hearing members asked the assembled law enforcement chiefs about the online activity of the alleged Poway shooter, who appears to have posted a manifesto as well. It was 8chan site and has been cheered on there and have white supremacist attackers before him. So Representative Mike Rogers, the ranking Republican member of the committee, asked intelligence and law enforcement experts from FBI, Justice Department, and Department of Homeland Security how the U.S. can tackle the issue, seeking advice to guide possible legislation. So, do you have any recommendation about what can be done to address the violent hate speech and incitement of violence found on fringe sites like 8chan and Gab? So, there's sites, y'all, that are up specifically for white nationalist groups and white hate groups where they pretty much cheer each other on when a deadly attack occurs, or they'll talk or create a manifesto and cheer each other on and pretty much ignite that whole movement. So he was met with silence, and so they have not said anything on these issues about how to deal with these sites. You notice how YouTube, Instagram, if people say too much on there, they do too much that goes against, certain policies, your channels get shut down, or they might even call law enforcement or the social media police. Well, these 8chan and Gab and all these sites, there's certain sites where they have channels, these hate groups, they don't shut those down. They're investigating them, but nothing has been done to completely shut these sites down. Of course, they have other ways of communicating through rallies and through their meetings, which the alt right has displayed. Even in the documentary, they hold meetings in places where they, set up where they're going to have their next rallies or they're going to have their next demonstration or protest. And so y'all don't have any suggestion for us, responded the Alabama congressman. That's scary. We can't make policy without good advisement. So the officials then explained the difficulties in monitoring the forums and balancing free speech. Department, or DHS, says that they have developed robust partnership with the tech sector. Well, I believe they're just monitoring it. They're not really shutting the channels down. And two, to be honest, I believe some of the people that are working for these groups, they might be a part of it. They just can't show their face or they can't show that they're part of these groups, but they support it. Silently they support it. That's the reason why they've been emboldened to go on for so long and not been caught, not been given out harder sentences until now. Because people are dying. And it's not just of viruses, but it's also these are the other issues that people are dying of is homegrown terrorism outside of international terrorism. But the root of all of it, again, is that there is no domestic terrorism statute. So, which is another reason that Vance wrote the letter. I think it's a big problem, and that we focus so much on Islamic radicalism since 2000, since the 9/11 attacks, but that I think perhaps we've taken our eye off the ball of what is equally a large problem as well, and that is those who are being radicalized in our midst, Vance told CNN. So he admits that he was himself late to see the issue. So in Manhattan District Attorney, I profess having more ignorance than I should have had, but I'm now paying attention. He says, if I'm not paying attention to it, then probably a lot of people aren't paying attention to it enough also. And so he now set his office on a new course in hopes that more will follow his suit from the federal level on down, however painful it may be. So I think as white Americans, we may not be as readily willing to identify this group as terrorists that are like us, he said, but he thinks that perhaps a little bit of human nature is easier to identify the enemy as someone who doesn't look like you or doesn't speak the languages you do. But when it's your neighbor and like people then it's hard to call them out and call them terrorism. Call it terrorism. So that's pretty much the article. I know it was long, but I feel like I wanted to relate it to some of the things that are going on because it's all connected. And so, anyway, with that being said, what do you think about this as an additional bonus article having to do with some of the more prevalent things that are going on in this country, the U.S., right now, that are very serious issues that are being looked at and sought against? Um, and that is the reason why we have so many articles, so many things that are going on social media showing how Black people, residents, just having everyday lives are being attacked at random. And they're no longer viewed as isolated incidences as they once were because it's all too prevalent and it's all too real. And it's happening right in people's towns and cities and states and streets where we're seeing this. And what are your thoughts and views on this? So this is the additional article. With that, I'm going to leave this article and I'm going to let this go. And I will go back to the first article that has to do with these anti-vaccine movements. So these are the two things that are going on that are really big in the US right now. Outside, among other things, there's some other things going on, but these are the terms of the mortality rate of people and livelihood. These are probably the most imminent threats right now. Thanks for listening.